I am pleased to introduce to you our first customer speaker. His name is Mark Russell. Actually, I just met him and I just took his name tag off of his neck, so we're really good friends now. Mark began his career in film production in Los Angeles, working on groundbreaking films such as Saving Private Ryan, Minority Report, and Hellboy. Since moving to New York, he has supervised the visual effects in many independent projects. Currently, Mark is in the final stages of post-production of Martin Scorsese's The Wolf on Wall Street, due out later this year. Mark, why don't you come on up? Let's give Mark a hand. Thank you. You're my brother.
Appreciate that.
And what do you think of our new workstations?
They're awesome.
Yeah?
Can't wait to play with them.
All right. Play and work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, take it away. Okay. Here's the clicker.
As Jim said, my name is Mark Russell. I am a visual effects producer and supervisor. I've been living here in New York for about 10 years now, after being in Los Angeles prior to that. I'm a creative problem solver, and my job is generally to extend the director's vision beyond what's physically possible within the camera. That being said, I want to wake you guys up with a little bit of what I've been working on for the past year. So if you guys could play the clip, please.
My name is Jordan Belfort. The year I turned 26, I made $49 million, which really pissed me off because it was 3 shy of $1 million a week. We're making a name for ourselves.
Nobody knows if the stock is going to go up, down, sideways, or in circles. You know what Fugazi is?
Well, Fugazi, it's fake.
Yeah, Fugazi, Fugazi, it's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust.
Was all this legal? Absolutely not. We were making more money than we knew what to do with.
Well, don't work for you, man.
Yeah, my money can't pay boobs. Take it easy.
What's going on down
Oh my God. FBI, any kind of booze you might want? The Bureau forbids us from drinking. Duh.
So follow me, I could grab it low. I'm going 500, I'm out of control. But there's nowhere to go, and there's no way to slow. If I knew what I knew in the bed, I would have been like that on your.
How does this actually work?
There's a big money sign.
They get launched after they stick.
This is their gift, okay? They're built to be thrown like a lawn dart.
Stop. Okay? Safety first. Safety is first. We don't want to get a bad reputation.
Thank you. Kind of gets you going in the morning, doesn't it? I stopped drinking coffee since working on this. As the visual effects producer on that film, I deal primarily with budgets and logistics, but also a great deal of the creative. It's not really what one would call a visual effects heavy film, but it does have some really interesting sequences in it that couldn't have been accomplished without the help of me and my team and Rob Legato, who's the effects supervisor, and visual effects in general. We have a couple scenes. One is a giant yacht that sinks off the Mediterranean coast, which, as you can imagine, is something that's really difficult to shoot practically, especially when it's a 180-foot yacht that costs a couple $1 million. Nobody wants to spend that kind of money to sink it. So we have scenes like that. We have a couple helicopter scenes where our lead character, Jordan, is flying around somewhat intoxicated in a helicopter. And these scenes are things that needed to be accomplished with the help of visual effects, which is where we come in. A large part of my job during physical production and principal photography is managing the acquisition and capture of all of the raw materials that we need in order to finish the movie down the road and complete post-production. So in addition to what the main unit photographs, which is, on this movie was partially film and partially digital, there are a lot of elements that we need to shoot along the way to help us fill in the gaps. For instance, one of the clips I'll show you in a few minutes involves a scene that's on top of a yacht in the Mediterranean. We shot the entire movie here in New York, so rather than bringing the entire cast and crew to Italy, they sent me and a very small team of people to go shoot the backgrounds, which was a real chore, I have to tell you. It was really, really a terrible thing, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Essentially, I have huge amounts of data that I have to gather, track, and then distribute to the different vendors working on the movie. There's a great deal of transcoding, color processing, and just general file organization that I have to do on a daily basis to get the clips in the right hands at the right format. And prior to this job, I was exclusively a Mac user. But things are changing, as you guys will see. This next clip that I'm going to show you, if you guys can run this one, please, was photographed from an octocopter using a Canon C500 digital camera. It's the first half of what will ultimately be a single stunning shot approaching a giant house party in the Hamptons. But as you can see here, there's no house party. There's really no house that we're going into. We're putting the house right in the middle. But because we shot the location with the actors in an area that was much closer to New York City, it didn't have this grand feel of the Hamptons. So again, they sent out a small visual effects crew to go photograph this plate in the Hamptons. We were using, well, let me start by saying there are a number of things about the story I thought you guys would find interesting. The first, an octocopter. Everyone know what an octocopter is? No, I didn't either at the time, but an octocopter is a small helicopter. It's a remote control drone, essentially, with 8 rotors. So it's about this big, weighs about 18 pounds, including the camera. And we were using the Canon C500, which was a prototype at the time. It shoots 4K RAW right out of the camera, but you have to have an external recorder. So we used a recorder called the Gemini, which was attached to that. The Gemini hadn't been very well tested with the camera at the time, so it was really important that we figured out a way to review the footage before we left the location. And to make sure that we had everything we needed before we moved on and said that we were good. And finally, most significantly, at the time, the Canon 4K RAW files could only be transcoded using Canon's beta software, which didn't run on a Mac, and had to be installed by them. So, working with HP, we got an EliteBook. We had Canon install the software on the EliteBook, and I took that out to the set with us in the Hamptons, and we were able to fly the helicopter, which can only fly for about 4 minutes at a time before you have to change the batteries. So each take was a start before it took off, and then about 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes, and then we would stop. And 4K RAW is about 11 megabytes per frame, which translates to about 65 gigs per take. So while on set, they would fly the helicopter, and of course you saw the shot. We were trying to do this at the end of the day, what we call magic hour, which is about a half-an-hour window of sunlight. So they would go up and shoot, they would come back, land the helicopter, take the batteries out, take the cards out, and the Gemini records to 2 SSD cards simultaneously. It records 1 frame here, and 1 frame there, and 1 frame here, and 1 frame there. So in order to review the shots, I had to combine all the files onto a single drive. So I had to then take the cards with 70 gigs, or sometimes it was 3 and 4 takes at a time, 150 gigs of material. I had to throw onto a hard drive just in order to be able to look at them to make sure that they were viewable. Then once they were viewable, I would transcode them so that we could view them. And I was able to do this with an EliteBook on the day, on the beach, while watching the sunset, which wasn't so terrible. The only downside was it did take quite a while to transfer the files, so my hope is that now with Thunderbolts, I won't have to wait around for that. I have a second clip. This one is the same as the octocopter setup, but it was used in a very different way. So if you guys could play that second clip. What we did here is we knew that we had a scene to shoot where our lead character Jordan was flying around in a helicopter while somewhat inebriated. We needed to shoot it at night, and this was over Upper Brookville in Long Island, which is a very, very fancy, exclusive neighborhood that A, we couldn't fly a helicopter over, and B, we couldn't really light it at night for any amount of time. So what we decided to do was create the environment in CG. So we have created this entire landscape of this house, the yards around it, some neighboring houses, all digitally so that we could relight it for nighttime. So what I did is we took the helicopter up and we flew around the house very slowly, capturing different angles so that we could then pull individual frames to build the house in 3D in the computer, and then use the images from this camera to texture map that 3D model so that it looks absolutely authentic when you see it later in the film. And it allows us the flexibility to put the camera anywhere we want and then relight the entire scene however we want. So we can spotlight certain things, we can take things down, we can be inside this helicopter, which we later shot on green screen, and put the background anywhere we want so that it has the most dramatic effect for the movie. Again, this was with the C500 and the Octocopter and the Elite Book, which we really wouldn't have been able to do without it. One of the scenes toward the end of the film, which I'll get to in just a minute, takes place on board a luxury yacht while moored in an Italian harbor. And as I mentioned before, it's very prohibitively expensive to fly a film crew and the cast and all the parts that come with that to Italy to shoot this thing. So we basically shot 3 days on a stage in New York, surrounded by a green screen. And then they sent a small unit, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 of us, that went to Italy to photograph the plates. And we cruised around the Italian Riviera in a yacht for a few days. Photographing really beautiful scenery. It was really awful. I wouldn't wish that upon any of you. While doing that, one of the things that we do, and one of the things that I did in particular on this job, was in every environment, in a lot of the locations throughout the entire movie, I would use HDRI photography, so high dynamic range imaging, to capture an entire environment. And essentially what I would do is I would go out and I would shoot 360 degrees, 7 exposures in each position, so that we had the entire latitude from light to dark. So that in order to recreate that environment later, I then had all of the data that I needed from the darkest exposure to the brightest exposure in an entire sphere. And what I'll do is I'll show you how we built this. If you guys could run the next clip. Essentially, there's me in the shadow with the tripod, taking the 9 exposures. And what this does, this allows us to use this circular image to do 2 things. It allows us to put it in the background of a green screen shot if we need to, although it's always better to use moving footage for that. But more importantly, it allows us to create essentially a ball, a sphere that goes around the virtual environment that we use to pour light through. So that when we light the CG boat that is ultimately going to be sitting at this dock, it's lit by essentially the real environment. So you get different light coming through the clouds, different light and darkness coming off of the islands, the water has a reflective quality, and all of that is from a real photograph from the real location. And in addition to that, the reflections that are then generated later on the sides of the CG boat that help make it look real all come from this photograph. So in the computer, you tell the computer camera to say, look at this, anywhere that the light is bouncing, I want you to reflect this in the image. And this is essentially what makes things look real and look like they're in the real environment. One of the things that we were able to do while on location, we had an Elite Book with a dream color monitor, and we were able to really look at things in their true color and know that we were going to be looking at the same thing when we got back to our offices later down the road, which in my business is so important because if you miss it on the day, it costs hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to go back and recreate it, and nobody likes to hear that you were already out there and you have to go back. So try and avoid that at all costs. Essentially, what I wanted to say was that HP workstations have become a huge part of my workflow. Having been a Mac guy exclusively up until about a year ago, I now find that I use my HP workstation about 60% of the time. And the Mac is mostly for email at this point. So thank you guys very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of it.